Welcome to the 18th episode of Startup Strides. Today, my guest is Hannah Payette Peterson. She's a biotech, neurotech venture analyst at Apollo Health Ventures. Welcome, Hannah. Very nice to have you on.
Thanks. Excited to talk to you.
Actually, this is a special episode because Hannah, we both went to the same college. We both went to Amherst College. So it's not just an interview. It's also kind of like getting to talk to an alum of my school, which is a really always a nice experience. Hannah, let's obviously we're gonna start with your background first, and I already mentioned that you went to Amherst College, but let's talk about since the beginning, before the venture, role and work. Can you kind of walk us through your academic and professional background?
Yeah, so my background is in biology and neuroscience. So I went to Amherst College, like you said, and I studied biology, but with a focus on neuroscience, which basically meant that I took all of the neuroscience classes that existed, just because I was really interested. I worked in neuroscience research then, both in my undergrad and for the first few years following graduation. So immediately following my graduation, I moved to Spain, worked for 2 years in a neuroscience lab there. And then I moved to Berlin, Germany, where I live now. Also started off working in a neuroscience lab. Then the pandemic came, the lab stopped operating for a while, and I was kind of trying to figure out what to do. So at that point, I knew that I didn't necessarily want to stay in academia for the rest of my career. Although I love science, I enjoyed research, but I was kind of interested in biotech startups, but I didn't really know anything about them or what other options were out there. And also the lab was kind of stopped functioning because of lockdown. So during that time period, I ended up getting a little bit of experience working with some tech startups. I did a data science boot camp to get a little bit more technical data analysis background. And then I, as the pandemic was sort of ending, began a master's in molecular medicine here in Berlin, which is essentially biomedical research. So that's my background before VC.
That's super cool. That's really cool. And okay, let's get to the VC part. Like, you eventually decided to pivot in VC direction. You already mentioned that you were interested in biotech startups, but like, why exactly VC? What was appealing about VC?
So I found my way into VC in sort of an unusual way, in that it was really by chance, which is not how it works for most people. It's usually very difficult to break into VC. But I met someone just virtually during lockdown who had worked for a fund, and she mentioned that they were looking for someone with a neuroscience background to help with neurotech investments, and connected me to the partner who ended up hiring me. So I wasn't necessarily seeking out VC roles. I was interested. This was during the time period where I was sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. I was interested in biotech, interested in startups, but didn't really know where to start, which I think is a really common experience for people who are in academia. And then this random connection to a VC came up, and I spoke with a partner, and it just seemed super interesting to me. And this was a partner who had a finance and business background, and was looking for someone to help out on the science side. And so it really was a good connection. And I jumped at the chance, and then I figured over the next couple years that VC is actually a really good fit for my interests and my skill set, I think. So I really love what I do, and I'm super grateful for having that sort of chance encounter that led me to VC. And so now I've been working in VC for almost the past 3 years in parallel with my master's, which I'm essentially done with. I just have to do my thesis for my master's. But yeah, so now I feel I've come a long way since the beginning there.
Got it. And you're currently working at Apollo Health Ventures, right? How you ended up there, and tell me about Apollo Health Ventures. What's the investment thesis of the, I guess, that venture firm, and what kind of companies do you guys typically invest in?
Yeah, so I was first hired by Truventuro, which is a family office that operates as an early stage VC fund. It was founded by a startup founder who had an exit in Germany. And at Truventuro, I was working only on neuro-related topics. Though most of the fund does general tech and e-commerce stuff, there's a small subset of neuroscience, of neurotech investments there. And the same person who founded Truventuro also founded Apollo, which is only focused on life science investments, and the two funds work closely together. So I was often working on Apollo projects as well with Apollo people as well. And at some point, it just made more sense to switch over to officially working for Apollo. So I kind of found my way just because these funds are really closely working together. But Apollo is I think a really good fit for my interests. So it's focused only on life science investments, very medically focused, and also very early stage. And this fits really well with my interest in, I love really getting to focus on the science and the research and speaking with scientists. So the thesis of Apollo is extending healthy lifespan, but this is quite broad. So this is not just specifically longevity, which is not something that I've personally worked so much on, although there are some others in the fund who work more on this, but it's also a lot of different medical treatments, a lot of focus on age-related diseases. So this is a huge variety of things, including neurodegenerative disease, liver disease, cancer. And as I mentioned, we're really early stage focused. So we either invest in early stage startups or we also do company building. So we will find a particular area of research that we think is promising and find labs that might have the most cutting edge research in this area and maybe have tech that is ready to be commercialized, and we'll approach them and help them build a company around it. Or we will even propose a hypothesis and hire a scientist to help investigate it and build a company around that. So really early stage focus, which puts a lot of emphasis on the science and the tech and kind of translation from research to startups.
I see. Besides neurotech, do you have any other disease areas or indications or research areas that you're really excited about that you like to, find companies?
So I would say neuro has always been kind of a huge interest of mine, but what I really like about VC is that you get to be exposed to a variety of different topics. So it's not just, one thing that you're focused on all the time. You get to do a deep dive for a few months on one area of research, and then the next few months, maybe you're looking at something really different. So I've also looked at blood substitutes, organ transplantation, what else? Organoids for developing drugs against liver disease. So I get exposed to a lot of different things, which I really love, getting to just be learning all the time.
Got it. Just kind of looking at VC and doing through my own conversations and through my own research, what I've noticed that, most people have either PhDs or MDs, right? It's very rare to see somebody with bachelor's and a partner role, whatever. And you have a very significant science background. You've studied science in college, you've done masters, you've done research in Europe. But one thing I'm curious about, why you didn't pursue PhD, or whether you have plans to pursue PhD or not. And two is, do you think PhD is essential to be working in VC? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about because, as you mentioned, I don't yet have a PhD. I don't think it's essential. I do think it's a common path, but I don't necessarily think it's the only one. Obviously, I think scientific and research experience is really important. So I would say that you should have at least several years of research experience, likely at least a master's, because you need to have enough general biomedical background knowledge. You need to understand the process of scientific research and the culture of academia to a degree. You need to be able to read papers well and evaluate research critically. And like I mentioned, you need to be able to learn new topics quickly and know how to ask the right questions, even for topics that you're not an expert on. And a PhD can, of course, prepare you really well for these skills, especially giving you a lot of background in the process of research. But I actually don't think it's necessarily the best preparation for this. So when you're doing a PhD, you're focused really narrowly and deeply on one specific topic for years at a time. And then if you go and work in VC, the chances of your specific domain knowledge being relevant for most of the work you do is really low. So the most useful skill in VC, in my experience, is being able to learn new topics quickly and jump between very different biomedical topics and know how to critically evaluate them. And also kind of knowing what you don't know and when you need to reach out to experts in different fields. So a lot of the skills you learn doing a PhD won't necessarily be directly relevant for work in VC. And so if you're spending years working on this, you're of course not spending that time developing other skills and learning in other ways, like starting earlier in VC, uh, working in or founding startups, working in a business in some capacity. So it's always a trade-off. Of course, some people are really focused on titles. And, it's always nice to be able to show the title of PhD. But I think if you're able to show that you bring another type of experience to the table that you wouldn't have had if you'd spent the time working on a PhD, that this can give you other advantages. So these are things that I've considered. I think ultimately people tend to arrive in VC from a variety of different paths. And I think the prevalence of PhDs in VC is also maybe partly due to the fact that people often don't leave academia until after their PhD because they're just not aware of what other career options are out there. I might be sort of biased because I don't have a PhD myself, but at the moment I'm not planning on getting one. This might change, but I feel like doing a PhD wouldn't necessarily be the best thing to help me build the skills and experience that would really help me be successful in my current career path. If I feel like I'm really limited by the lack of a PhD, of course, I can always decide, let me go back into research. But I've also had some people suggest, well, it could be really helpful to get an MBA. But ultimately, I think the time that I've been spending in VC, I wouldn't have had this chance if I had been already starting a PhD. And so I think that's been really valuable. So to sum up, a lot of thoughts there, but I would say not necessary, definitely a common path and can be helpful. But I think, there are a lot of different skill sets that can be useful for VC.
Got it. I do think you have a very valid point, especially because PhDs obviously meant to equip you with skills like, being able to read and analyze data, different papers and different kind of like scientific research areas. But at the end of the day, if somebody starts a company, the company founder is the expert in their area to be able to even start a company. So you'll never be able to like truly fully grasp everything about the company, which brings me to my next question, right? What's your approach to sourcing new investments? Especially because like, let's say if you come across a very promising company, biotech company in an unfamiliar area of science, how do you educate yourself on the topic? Do you read academic papers? Do you consult experts or use other methods?
Yeah, I think that's a good point that I think as a technical founder of a biotech startup, that is a situation where it's a lot more important to have a PhD. But as a VC, I think it's really important to have a deep and broad scientific background, but having that extra specialization is maybe not useful the way it is if you're founding a company. So in terms of sourcing investments, so I read a lot of papers. At Apollo, we work very early stage. And so this means that a lot of the time we are working with scientists who are still in academic research, who haven't spun out their research yet. And so I'm really reading a lot of papers. I will speak to experts or scientists I know who maybe have more direct experience with a field or a topic, but also ultimately just going straight to the scientist or the company and asking, hey, can we have a call? Can you walk me through your research, your data? Because this is also really revealing. Like a prepared founder should be able to explain their research well and in detail to someone with biological knowledge, but maybe not particular domain expertise. And I think if they can't explain it to you, of course, you need to be able to, brush up and learn about specific topics. But if they're not able to explain it to you in a way that's clear, that's also kind of an indicator that they might not be prepared to be in a founding role. So I would say, yeah, papers, speak to other scientists, speak directly to the company or the founder.
And if you, when you're doing your, because like initially, especially in biotech, it's very hard to have a kind of proof of concept, right? It's not very feasible. And biotech is investments usually take a while to really bring a product to the market, right? Especially if it's a drug, it takes an average of 10 to 15 years. So when you look at an idea, a paper, how do you evaluate the company potential of that science, right? Besides the let's say the science team behind it, what key things you look for?
I mean, it depends a lot on the specific case because in my experience, it's a huge range of things that I've looked at, but you really have to look deeply at the research, look at similar academic research, look at the data they have and see, okay, how far are they? How promising is this? When you're investing early, you're kind of by definition taking on tech risk, and this is part of the package, but also what makes it exciting. So a lot of the focus does have to be on how promising is the tech, but also what happens in a lot of really early stage biotech companies is they will not necessarily only be operating with VC funding, but there are a lot of cases where founders will continue to have some amount of public funding, non-dilutive funding, as well as VC investment that can kind of allow them to get a bit further in the process while they're maybe beginning to work with VCs, that allows for a little bit of de-risking. So rather than a VC funding the entire development process, a lot of that development happens during the transition phase out of university. So it might still happen when they're in the university lab with guidance from the VCs. And then at a certain point, it reaches a place where it's a little bit less risky and they can be switching to operating more on private funding. But there's at the beginning a little bit of a mix of public and private funding that can help de-risk a bit. And also at an early stage, as you mentioned, the team is really important. So there might be really promising research, but good scientists don't always make good founders. And there are huge kind of cultural differences between academia, science, and startups, entrepreneurship. This is something that I really love about the job, actually, is getting to bridge these gaps between the science and the business. But it's important to look at the founders and, if there's great research, but the founders they might be experts in their field, but if they're really disorganized, if they're unable to take feedback, if they're unable to kind of admit what they don't know about the business side, if they're really difficult to work with, they're probably not going to be successful founders, and also just not people that you want to work with as a VC, especially as an early stage VC where you are really hands-on helping them build the company. And so that's a big part of determining whether something is a good investment as well.
You mentioned a very interesting thing, so I'm going to ask you, based on that, a question. What useful things have you personally experienced of things that really help to bridge that gap between academia and like entrepreneurship and biotech? Because I know like one of the things is like Nucleate, which kind of really expanded in US and then to Europe, and I believe it's in the UK, in Germany, etc. What other things have you seen, or like maybe you can tell me more about Nucleate and what does it do?
Yeah, I've been really involved with Nucleate, which just I can briefly mention what it is in case people haven't heard of it. So it's a nonprofit organization, completely student-led, volunteer-run. It started in Boston. It's now spread really worldwide. So there are chapters all over the place. There's a chapter in Berlin, a German national chapter as well. And the idea is to promote entrepreneurship among scientists and to help academic scientists to learn about what it means to be an entrepreneur, to learn about career options outside of just, working in academia, and to help teach them how to actually spin out their research and build a company, if that makes sense for them. So this is something that I sort of wish I had access to earlier in my career, although I did sort of find my way out of pure academia fairly early. Most people, I feel like, take until after their PhD. I was exposed to startups a bit earlier just by being around tech startups in Berlin. But, even when I was working in research in Spain, I knew, okay, I love research, but I don't want to be a professor. But I didn't have any idea what was out there aside from academic research. And so Nucleate will run workshops directed at scientists to teach them what it's like to found a startup, skills that they need to know, just expose them to people who are in the entrepreneurship space. And we also run an activator program, which is essentially an equity-free incubator for biotech founders. And so we will take, people can apply with a particular idea or particular research that they want to build a company around, and we'll take them through a series of workshops, match them with mentors, and help them through the whole process of beginning to build a company. So this is super important, I think, just educating scientists in how to become entrepreneurs, what else is out there. I think this is something that's missing from a lot of academic programs. And I think academia can feel very siloed, very isolated in a lot of ways. But I think kind of breaking down these barriers and allowing scientists to see, look, this is how science is applied in the context of companies. This is how research is translated into medical treatments. And just being a bit more open about that is only going to benefit everyone. Because it's only a benefit if really cool research that's happening in universities can actually make it out and can start impacting patients. So education, I would say, is a big thing. And, organizations like Nucleate, they're also here as well, are always increasing kind of numbers of incubator programs or educational programs that try to connect science and the startup scene. But I could use more of those.
Makes sense. You work with so many founders through Nucleate, through your own, through the venture capital firm. What qualities do you see in good biotech founders? I guess, how would you describe a good biotech founder? What patterns you have seen?
I think, as I mentioned, there are some big cultural differences between academic science and startups. And I think in academic science, researchers are often very used to working on kind of a very specialized but small range of topics. And, they might be really good at developing research skills, at writing papers, but they're maybe not so good at communicating with a non-scientific audience. They might know nothing about business. I know I knew nothing about business when I was first kind of stepping out of the academic realm. They might struggle to make good presentations about their work or to summarize it in a way that non-scientists can understand. So I would say, kind of bridging these cultural differences are tough, but if there are scientists who are willing to kind of admit what they don't know, are open to working with people from different backgrounds, I think it can be really, not everyone has to be a CEO. If you're a scientist and you don't like being a public figure to some degree, as a CEO has to be, you can be a CSO or a CTO, and you can maybe find a business person who has some experience in biotech or in science who is more comfortable in that role. So I think being humble and being able to admit, okay, these are where I am great and these are where I really need help. That's important. As a startup founder, you need to be able to do a huge range of different things. So it's just how startups work. You have to, at the early stages, be helping out with everything. So, scientists might be used to only focusing on their research, but as a founder, you're going to need to make really nice looking pitch decks, talk to investors. You're going to need to probably help build your website or help come up with a marketing strategy or a sales strategy or do accounting, like things that scientists would never expect to have to do. And I think just being able to let go of sort of a perfectionist mindset and just say, like, I'm just going to learn. I'm going to, help out in all the ways that I can will bode well for a scientist's ability to become a founder. I think also communication skills are really important. So being able to, and this, some scientists are really good at this. Some, it might not come as easily, but being able to communicate with business people. And I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but, very different ways of communicating. And so learning a little bit of the cultural difference and being able to present yourself in a way that is also not compromising any of the precision of your language in the way that you talk about your research, but being able to communicate in a way that business people understand is really important.
Biotech, venture and, startup ecosystem is very fast-paced, dynamic system. You have to be really fast, right? And as you mentioned, coming from science background, scientists are mostly science focused. But when it comes to like a company building, you have to know talk to investors, as you said, like the intellectual property, marketing, investor relations, et cetera, right? And obviously you can't go to school for every one of them. So you have to just learn on the job by doing it. But what's the best way to really try to like gain that knowledge on the job without really compromising, the startup development, right? Like how do you manage to learn so much in such a short period of time?
Well, I think if scientists are exposed to the startup world at an earlier stage, that's helpful. I think it can be really sort of a shock if you just come straight out of academia into being a founder and you haven't seen other founders go through the process, or you don't really know how the startup world works. For me, I was first exposed to startups because I had some close friends who were startup founders in tech, not in biotech, but this was my first exposure to the startup world and just seeing how things work. So for one, I think just, being involved with organizations like Nucleate, getting to talk to founders before you're starting your own founding journey can be really helpful. And then also just getting comfortable with a level of chaos that you're not used to in the lab, I think it's just the natural state of startups, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be exciting. It can be really stressful for some people. And for those people, it's probably not, a great path for them to be founders, but some people love that. I like that to a degree. And, being comfortable with that and then knowing who to go to for advice. Like, I think academia it depends really on the environment, but it can feel very hierarchical in a way and very sort of like, okay, I need to just, pay my dues, play my role until I work my way up. But in startups, there are no rules to a degree. Like if you're founding, you should approach other founders and ask them about their experiences or talk to, just reach out to investors and just say, hey, I would love your advice on this thing. Can I just talk to you for 15 minutes? Or, be open to networking and speak to as many people as you can so that you're learning from other people's experiences and you don't have to necessarily make all the mistakes yourself, I would say.
Anna, you mentioned a really interesting thing. So I want to ask a follow-up question based on that. You said, talk about your ideas to investors or whatever, right? At what point you should be kind of wary or concerned about like protecting your intellectual property, right? Because, you never know, right? Talking to people, the ideas being shared. At what point you should be like kind of careful. You want to obviously talk to people, get their, opinions. You want to talk to investors, but also you want to protect your idea in case it has a huge potential.
Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of scientists aren't aware of, is how important intellectual property is to investors. So one of the first things that investors will always ask a startup that's trying to fundraise is about their intellectual property. And this is another cultural difference between academia and the world of startups, where in academia, you want to publish everything you find as soon as you find it out. But if you're wanting to found a startup, this is not the way that you need to operate. This in some ways is kind of too bad, because in an ideal world, we would just share everything. But, we're working within the constraints of capitalism, and an investor needs to see that there's some sort of defensibility and some sort of protection of your intellectual property in order to be able to invest. So I would say the areas that are going to be sort of most useful for you to be getting advice from other founders might not have to do with the details of your tech, but it might be more about like, hey, I want to learn about what the process of founding is like. How do I go about negotiating with the university, the tech transfer office, to get control of my intellectual property, that kind of thing. But I think, you can get useful advice without having to discuss the details of your tech. But I think if you're interested in founding a startup, you do need to be thinking really early about intellectual property. And you need to be thinking, okay, there are certain points where the first thing we need to do should be patent rather than publish. And getting advice from other founders who've been through this can be helpful, because they might be able to say, hey, talk to this patent lawyer, or use these strategies for negotiating with the university. But I would say, be aware that that's something you need to protect early on, but it doesn't preclude you getting advice about the whole process of founding. If that makes sense.
Got it. I guess let's get back to the VC and investment stuff, right? I meant to ask this question before, but you work at the Apollo Health Ventures and you're a VC analyst. There are different roles, right, in VC firms, and from VC firm to VC firm, it usually changes. Usually the one I am aware of is that general partners are the ones that kind of have the decision-making power when it comes to investments. But can you tell us about your responsibilities, and can you guys kind of give us like a brief breakdown of what each role entails?
Yeah, this really depends, I think, on the fund. So I can just speak from my experience, because I still feel it's somewhat limited. Like I haven't worked in a ton of different places, but we're not a large fund. So things are sort of informal in a way. So when I started working in VC, I was working with, as I mentioned, a partner who had a background in finance and investing, but not a scientific background. So I was really focused on the scientific topics, helping give feedback about particular areas of research and due diligence. But I wasn't so involved on the sort of other aspects. I was there observing and learning, but not providing so much input over that. But over the past few years, I've learned a lot, and I have a much better understanding of how startups work, of the business side of things. So I'm able to be involved in a lot of different topics now. And really what I work on, it's a huge range, and it depends on what we need at the moment. So it can be, from doing overviews of interesting areas of research, or of, mapping companies in a particular space, finding the most promising labs that have cutting edge research on a particular topic, speaking to scientists or speaking to founders, helping portfolio companies fundraise. So I've, made pitch decks for portfolio companies, spoke to other investors. So it's a huge range of things. I mean, in some ways, similar to being a founder, I would say maybe not quite as wide a range of things, but, still a pretty wide range day to day of things that you're working on, because you're helping founders, you're helping build companies, and also just looking into different areas of science. So this is also why I love it. But I get to help out with a lot of different things. It's true that I'm not yet the one who makes the final decision on whether we invest in something. I still feel really new to VC. I've learned a lot, obviously, but I'm still not at the partner level deciding, okay, we're going to pull the trigger and invest in this company. But I do work with people who take my ideas seriously and value my input. So I definitely feel that, the partner that I work most closely with if we're looking at a company and I were to say, this doesn't look promising, I think for these reasons we shouldn't invest in it, I do think he would say, okay, I trust your, input. We're not going to invest. So maybe I don't have the final decision to say, yes, we're going to invest, because I don't have, all of the knowledge about, okay, this makes sense for the fund strategically because we have, X amount of money left. We have these investments, but I do have sort of, I would say, veto power at the very least. And definitely people who take my ideas seriously.
Good. And you mentioned you said you make pitch decks for your portfolio companies, right? Just a very quick question: what makes a good pitch deck, especially when it comes to biotech?
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting process to make the pitch deck, because it's a combination of understanding the science and their tech, and then understanding the market that they're entering into, and also kind of the argument and the story that you need to tell about this. So I think a lot of scientists will focus really on if they're really kind of coming at it from an academic science perspective, they'll focus on the research, which, I appreciate because I like to see the detail about the research. But then sometimes if they're thinking, okay, what does a business person want to see? They'll give this sort of sleek argument for this is going to be the next big thing, but not really go into detail about how it actually works. So I would say striking a balance. You need to be able to summarize things in a clear way, which is not compromising the precision of how you talk about it, but starting off without overwhelming the person who's looking at the pitch deck with information. Usually you start off by presenting, look, this is the problem. This is a gap in the market. This is a disease that doesn't have a treatment. It affects X number of patients every year. It's a big problem. And then you go into what your solution is, why it will make an impact. And also you should talk to some extent about how it actually works. So this means if you claim, like, we have the ability to do this, even if you're not showing it in your sort of short intro pitch deck, you should have then some supplemental slides saying, this is how this works. I would say it's kind of a pet peeve of mine to get pitch decks where, startups are making claims that they can do this thing and then they don't actually explain why. And, any good investor needs to see evidence that it actually works. We don't want more Theranoses. But yeah, so, problem, solution, how it works. Usually you talk about the team, why they're qualified. You would mention competitors, the competitive landscape, the market size, and kind of the potential for growth that you would have in this area. So, and then being able to present this information in a way that's effective visually is another challenge, I think, for a lot of scientists who just don't learn this as part of their education, but that's definitely important. So yeah, it's a skill that you just practice and you get better at.
What's the optimal slide size? How many slides do you like to see in a pitch deck?
I don't know. I think it depends. It depends if it's supposed to be like a 5-minute intro presentation versus a 30-minute let's give more detail. I don't know if I can give a number of slides. I feel like
that's fair.
The ones that I've made have been like 8 slides or something. It depends. I'd say it's more about the flow of the presentation and how you're expressing your ideas than just a specific number.
Got it. When it comes to investment landscape, right? Because I know, for example, during the pandemic, the biotech market was very bearish. There were a lot of investments, a lot of IPOs, especially mRNA technologies were really the hot thing during that time. How the investment activity in the space changed since then?
Yeah. I mean, in 2022, there was obviously a huge VC slowdown in general, which affected pretty much all industries, so biotech as well. But I think biotech is a growing field. So, COVID made it clear how important biotech is to the benefit of society. And there also are a lot of really exciting advances in science that are leading to a lot of new and exciting potential companies. So I think it's just growing. It's a field that I'm really excited to be in now. I think the timing is really great. And so, there might have been sort of a slowdown in 2022, but I think it's just a bump in the road. And in general, biotech is just continuing to become more important. So I don't know if you want more detail there, but that's my general
Apollo
impression.
has no, that's fair. Apollo has interest in longevity, right? Like extending human lifespan. And I feel like longevity in general has been kind of gaining traction lately. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of angel investing, VC investing, etc. And also there's a huge boom, obviously, in AI and machine learning and like large language models. So considering all that, what breakthroughs and innovations are you really excited about in biotech, and what kind of like things you not predict, but like what do you think gonna be kind of like the big things?
Yeah. Yeah, longevity is definitely sort of an up and coming field, but I think I think for some people, and also for me, and especially in the beginning, and in certain contexts, longevity as an idea can be sort of alienating because it's made up of a really wide range of different topics, some of which are like, Brian Johnson, I think, is this guy who's really interested in experimenting on himself to see if he can maximize longevity. Like, there's sort of extremes to it. So there are extreme examples like him. There are people who are really interested in cryopreservation, which as a topic, I mean, I love science fiction, super interesting, but also questionable science in a lot of these startups, just because it's so early. So for me, it was sort of at first very, in some ways, alienating. But what I think is really exciting, actually, which is part of this longevity hype, is the shift from reactive medical care to more of a focus on preventative care. So this, I think, is really interesting and will guide a lot of biomedical advancements in the coming years. So, in the past, generally, we've treated diseases once the symptoms are really clear and it's already a late stage of the disease, and there's only so much you can do at that point. But now, the more that we learn about different diseases, about risk factors, the more data we're able to collect about patients, the more we're able to prevent certain diseases or to reduce the risk of certain diseases. And this is generally going to lead, I hope, to an increase in the quality of life for a lot of people. So this is what I think is really exciting. And I would frame it rather than, of course, it will likely end up in an increase in health span and, maybe also lifespan. But I like to frame it more as, shifting from reactive medicine to proactive or preventative medicine. And then another area that I think is really exciting is neurotech. I mean, I'm biased because this is what I am super interested in, is neuroscience, but I think it's a very, very new field, even more so than biotech in general. But obviously you have, high profile companies like Neuralink getting a lot of hype, but there are a lot of companies that are less sort of mainstream hyped that are doing interesting stuff that I think, it's still very early, but I'm really excited to see where the whole field goes over the next few years. And then I can also you mentioned AI as well. So kind of ways that I would see AI and machine learning impacting biotech. So AI is really hyped at the moment, obviously, and hype should always be approached with skepticism, in my opinion. And, as someone with a scientific background, skepticism should always be the default. But hype just means that it's a crowded field, and there will be a lot of bad ideas or companies that won't succeed mixed in with a lot of good ones as well. So it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of potential there. It just means you need to sift through the bad ideas. Hype is also something to keep in mind when you're investing, because even if an idea is great, if everyone else sees that it's great and throws money at it, it can be a great idea, but it becomes a bad investment because it's too highly priced. But that said, I think that AI will be incredibly impactful, and I think there are a lot of different applications for it. So there's the sort of clear one with predicting protein folding, for example, but in general, helping to turn biology from a more sort of passive science into more of an engineering science. So advances in predicting protein folding can help a lot with this. Diagnostics, I think, have a lot of potential applications for AI. So being able to use machine learning on genetic data to diagnose genetic diseases, especially rare diseases, really interesting. Image recognition or segmentation, so identifying tumors, cancer cells, analyzing imaging such as X-rays or MRIs. There's potential to use AI in image analysis to improve and speed up processes such as high throughput drug screening, which can really streamline a lot of drug discovery. Also, related to sort of what I mentioned about longevity and preventative medicine is, like I said, more understanding of disease development and risk factors coupled with more data. So, more wearable devices can lead to better forecasting and preventative healthcare, and as sort of a really far future idea for applications of AI, which is a little more in the sci-fi realm, the idea of sort of digital twins or sort of simulated outcomes for patients. So maybe you can feed in the health data from patients, from wearables or from tests that you do, and you're able to use AI to sort of simulate what diseases they're likely to develop, what are their risk factors for certain things, and really harness this patient data, which is becoming more and more available for prevention and for sort of projection of what are your risks going forward. So I'm excited to see, again, like I said, really interesting time to be working in the field. A lot of hype to wade through, but that's part of the fun and the challenge.
I agree. Like neurotech is fascinating. I think I have a Medium blog that I started recently, and I'm kind of covering startups I find interesting. And one of them is Motif Neurotech, which I believe is in Series A stage, that's trying to develop this very small device to treat, not in a very minimally invasive way, to treat treatment-resistant depression. And I think it's fascinating. It provides a different method of, it's really cool company. And when it comes to like digital twins, I think I saw somewhere, I forget the name. I think.
Sorry, I was just going to say we spoke with Motif when they were still a lab, actually, before they had published anything about this device. I had read some of the founders' research about endovascular electrodes, and we actually approached him before there was a company, before there was a name, before anyone knew about him, about this research, these endovascular electrodes. And so for me, it's been really cool to see over the past couple of years, like there are actually a few cases of companies that we approached when they were labs that I had just found by reading a bunch of papers who are now really hyped. And we were talking to them kind of before their stuff was out there at all. So I've spoke to Jacob, I think 2.5 years ago or more, right at the beginning of my entry in VC. Cool company.
That's so good. Wait, there's so many papers out there. How do you, which websites do you use? Do you go on PubMed? Do you go on Nature, Neuroscience? Like, how do you find those cool papers and cool before they even like become massive?
I mean, usually we'll think about a particular area that's interesting. And I will just start Googling, like looking on Google Scholar for research related to this area. And then I'll kind of sift through what I think are the most interesting things. And this leads to, we have no geographical limitations with companies or labs that we work with. So we end up working with whoever has the most interesting research wherever it is. Sorry, you started to mention digital twins, and I think there's a delay, so I accidentally talked over you.
No, I was just saying Anna, it's completely fine. You're here to talk, I'm here to listen to you. No, I was just mentioning I think I saw somewhere companies that got funding to create digital twins for clinical trials. And I was like, this is also very fascinating. You mentioned geography, so we're coming towards the end of our podcast episode, but you mentioned geography. You're American, living and investing out of Europe. Besides the availability of capital, which is huge in America, in every VC, not just biotech, what other differences you see in, regional differences when it comes to biotech investment and biotech in general?
Yeah. So US is further ahead in commercialization of research for sure. But I would say Europe and Germany has a lot of high quality academic research. So there isn't really a difference in the research output of universities, but the difference is really in the translation. So there's less of a connection still between academia and the startup world, specifically in science. So this is in, one way that the US is further ahead, but also it means that there's an interesting opportunity here for growth. So at the moment, there are fewer biotech startups here for sure, but there's also a lot of research in universities that is maybe not being capitalized on that could be translated into startups. So this is a good opportunity for those who work in company building. And this is also why I work with Nucleate, to kind of help to bridge this gap between academia and startups. And yeah, I would say a big difference is, in the US, there's just more of a tendency to take the research that's happening in universities and commercialize it. And Europe is definitely moving in the right direction, but still just some years behind in this. So, I'm really interested in helping to build the biotech scene here. I think there's a lot more potential in Berlin, especially, that hasn't yet been realized. And also, the world is generally becoming more and more globalized. So as I mentioned at Apollo, we have no geographical limits with who we work with. So we work with a lot of US companies and labs. We'll also work with European companies. And I think there are also more US VCs that are seeing like, look, we don't want to actually be missing out on interesting research that's happening in other parts of the world too. And so they're interested in spreading their reach to Europe and to other places as well. And so, something else that I would love to do in my career as well is to help build connections between Europe and the US. So I'm from Boston. I grew up there. My family still lives there. I have a lot of connections there. And I feel like because I lived a lot of my life there and I've now lived for some years here, I have a bit of a feel of the cultural differences between the US and Europe. And I would love to try to bring these worlds together a bit more. I think, COVID pandemic, which led to things being online more often, more remote work, helps this trend. But I think there's, increasing trend of just globalization in, look, let's not be limited by geography as much as we can and just find the best opportunities that are out there. So I would say, still behind. There are also cultural differences where people in the US they have a tendency much more often to be really good at selling themselves. And to the point where you get, Theranos, where people are selling themselves to the degree where it's just fraud. And then in Germany, there's sort of a culture of like, oh, we don't want to overstate what we have. But this sort of humility that actually ends up just hurting them because maybe they have some really cool tech, but they're too cautious and they're not, able to hype it the way that it might actually deserve to be hyped. So I would love to find a bit of a balance between those two cultures where like, look, we can be confident and hype, our tech without overhyping. And we can be sort of bringing these two cultures together in a way that's beneficial to both sides. So this is my hope. I would love to be working globally in this way.
You mentioned interesting thing, commercialization of the products. One thing I'm curious about, how does the regulation environment of Europe differ from US? Is it harder to, bring a drug or med tech or neurotech into the market in Europe compared to US?
So it depends on the country, but this is also partly the challenge. So Europe is very fragmented in terms of there are certain things that are consistent across Europe, but then there are a lot of regulations, not even just specifically in bio, but just in terms of how you register a company or how you invest, the paperwork that you need to do for it. So there is a lot of fragmentation of these regulations across Europe because there are so many different companies. So there actually is a movement of founders in Europe that's trying to push for more standardization of these regulations, which I think would be a huge benefit. But I would say at the moment, the fragmentation is a real challenge. In terms of the regulatory approval for medical treatments, it's actually very common that even European-based biotech companies will go for FDA approval. As I mentioned, things are really globalized, and FDA is in some ways kind of a standard where if you get FDA approval, you're likely to also get approval in Europe. And so it's very common that, they're actually going through the same regulatory processes for the medical side of things as US companies. But there is definitely a challenge with regulation, just in terms of, fragmentation on the continent, and in terms of, not all countries have, it is changing and improving, but not all countries have regulations that are meant to benefit startups. Although there is definitely awareness in a lot of European countries that okay, we need to update this because, countries want to support their startup scenes, and there is a lot of cool research and innovation coming out of Europe, and so they're aware that okay, we need to be helping rather than hurting our entrepreneurs. So I think it's moving in the right direction. Still challenges, but also a lot of untapped, interesting ideas here. So
Anna, we're at the end of our episode. This was a very enjoyable conversation, and it's always nice to talk to somebody from Amherst. So it's an extra pleasure. My final question to you will be: what would you advise to entrepreneurs, maybe people getting their PhDs or looking into getting into starting their biotech firm? What's your advice when it comes to how to raise venture funding? How they should approach raising venture capital funding?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it would depend on, the background and the personality and skill set of the founder. But I would say the first thing you should consider is it a VC case? So not all good ideas are VC cases. In order for something to be a VC case, I mean, I would just begin to approach it from the perspective of understanding what the investor's goals are. So as a founder, you need to understand that VCs need to invest in companies that have the potential to grow to many times their original value. And an investor can love your research and tech and think that it's really cool and should be out there. But if it doesn't have growth potential, the math just won't work for them and they won't be able to invest. And then, going also with the theme of understanding the investor's goals, look at the focus of VC funds and approach VCs that fit with your topic or field. Otherwise, it just kind of ends up wasting everyone's time. As I mentioned, it's really important to keep in mind that IP is a topic of interest for investors. So you need to have defensibility. If you're coming from an academic background, I said before that there are really big cultural differences between academia and startups and business. So make sure to learn the skills that you're missing or be aware of the skills that you might be missing. Practice presenting yourself and your research or your company to an audience that is different than the scientists that you're maybe used to speaking with. But, in a way that's understandable to investors or business people. But like I mentioned before, explain your technology clearly. So, do say how it works. Don't gloss over that. So, be approachable in the way that you're explaining it, but also precise and clear and backing it up with data. So that was a lot of different things. But I would say first thing, imagine what the investors' goals are, and that will help you to present things to them in a way that makes sense.
Got it. Hannah, again, so grateful for your time. Appreciate this conversation. I'm actually moving to London this coming August to start my
Oh,
master's at
nice.
Imperial. So I'll be closer. If you ever end up in London, please let me know. I would love to meet up. And thank you so
Congrats.
much
That's
for this
exciting.
conversation. Appreciate your insights and your time.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to speak with you and speak about these topics that I find super interesting. So good luck in London. Let me know if you're ever stopping by Berlin.
I'll do that for sure. Take care. You have a great day.
Thank you.